Welcome everyone to NRBT's webinar, Cybersecurity Disruptors in the COVID-19 Era, Issues and Actions You Can Take. I'm going to get started this afternoon rather, because we have a long agenda, lots of great content and information for you. I'm Executive Vice President and COO at Newark Regional Business Partnership, and I am delighted to welcome you to our webinar today. We hope that at some point later in the fall or early spring, we will be able to come together again, but in the interim, we are happy that we're able to provide some really terrific content via webinar. All of you are muted and off camera during the duration of the webinar. If you want to pose a question, and we invite you to do so, please put that in the questions area. I will be checking the questions area through the duration of the program, and when the formal presentation is completed, I will be responding to the questions, asking the questions of our two speakers. So that's pretty much the logistics. We'll go for about 45 minutes, and around 2:45 or 2:50 is when we will take a look at the questions and answer questions. The next thing I'm going to do is thank our sponsors, Citrin Cooperman for sponsoring this webinar, and NJ Advanced Media for being our media sponsor through the year. We're very, very grateful to sponsors. They are essential to our ability to deliver quality programs, and it really helps. If you're interested in being a sponsor, we are offering much more modest rates for webinars than we do for in-person events. Also, we are currently starting to schedule for September and October. So if you have ideas on programs that you would like to offer on different topics that you think would appeal to a very wide interest audience, please forward those to me, to my email address, and we will consider any and all proposals for presentations. We'd be very happy to hear that. Just to go over what we have planned next week, we are continuing our diversity, equity, and inclusion mini-series on racial and economic disparities. Next week's program will be reimagining law enforcement and mending police-community relations. We have a really wonderful lineup of people to speak for that program, and I highly, highly encourage you to participate. You don't need to be someone in the DEI space to get great benefit from it. I think it's all a conversation that all of us need to be having now. We'll be continuing that series in September with either 2 or 3 additional sessions. One of them on Hire by Live Newark, which is on talent and using people to help them get jobs. And then education and healthcare, which may either be offered as 1 or offered as 2 sessions. We are also planning to hold some additional substantive webinars in September and October. We'll have our first regular live event on September 14th. Our golf outing is going ahead at Rock City Golf Club. And if you are a golfer and you are craving the social interaction of being at a live event, this is the one to sign up for. So please let me know if you're interested in doing that. We're also going to go back to our networking in the fall. We had curtailed our NRBP Nexus last week to take a little bit of a break in August, as well as our happy hour, and we're going to relaunch both of those. So if you are a potential Nexus guest, please let me know. And for happy hours, we're going to be partnering with Cool Vines Newark, and Cool Vines will be identifying a different provider of either wine or beer or spirits that will talk to us each week. So that's a summary of what's going on. The final thing that I'll mention in the DEI space is that we are about to launch a series of mini burst courses that can be taken at leisure. And the courses are being sold in packages of 4 courses that have things like being an upstander and unconscious bias. So if you haven't been able to offer this to your staff, this is a great opportunity to get a very reasonably priced access to quality training, and that will be announced. All of this has been led by Maya Curry, who is in the background and who helped to set up today's webinar. So with that, it's my great pleasure to turn to our speakers. We're going to be hearing from Kevin Ritchie, who's a principal in the Track Consulting division, and David Roath, who is a partner in that division. I am going to be turning this over now to David. I'll be turning my camera off and muting myself, and I'll come back around 2:45 to field questions. David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Barbara. So we'll talk a little bit about cybersecurity disruptors in the COVID era, and then different issues and actions you can take. We'll talk a little bit in terms of the agenda and meeting objectives, a little bit about us. We'll talk about what's happening today with a focus on tomorrow, right? Section 2 is hey, we hit COVID, we had some major issues. What are companies doing to deal with it? Have they identified all their issues? And then how are they starting to move forward? A little bit about recovery and reinvention, and then some of the business model risks, some of the adjustments that we're seeing taken around cybersecurity and privacy. And then what does the future look like from what we can gather and tell today with a very different environment than it was early March. Next slide. Okay. My name is, in terms of introductions, I lead our technology, risk advisory, and cybersecurity practice. Prior to this, I was with PwC for 27 years, and I helped build and lead the cybersecurity, IT risk, and privacy practice nationally. And then Kevin.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe. My name is Kevin Ritchie. I'm a principal with Citrin Cooperman. I've been with the firm for 18 years, and my primary role involves providing cybersecurity consulting, risk assessments, training, spear phishing campaigns, and compliance assessments to clients across the industry spectrum. I'm also a frequent contributor to a wide array of articles and a regular speaker for webinars, conferences, podcasts, and I think we have some great content in store for everyone today.
Great. Just a little bit about Citrin Cooperman. We have more than 1,350 partners and staff across the country, and we're part of a more network, and we're very much accounting, tax, and advisory. Next slide. Our technology, risk advisory, and cyber practice focuses on IT risk, risk advisory, internal audit, SOX compliance, and then cybersecurity and privacy. Next. This is where we'll talk a little bit about, what are we focused on today, understanding the cybersecurity and privacy landscape. A lot of the information that we got in here, we have public and private partnerships with the FBI, the Secret Service, various regulators from our experience in all different industries and sectors, and then different surveys that we've done and different client experiences. Next. Okay, and then here, the first half of 2020, we saw a lot around disruption, innovation, change. Security and privacy, as usual, turned into a foreign concept, right? There's a lot of things that, there was disruption, but now there's really disruption. And we see a lot of hacktivists and bad actors looking to take advantage of the work at home culture. We see a lot of phishing attempts. We still see technical hacks and people trying to get technically through the infrastructure, but we're seeing a lot of hacks through phishing, where someone will send out an email. It looks and feels because there's an alias, that it's coming from a certain person and they're looking to transfer money. They're looking to have someone get a gift card and send it. They're looking to get sensitive information, a user ID and password. And we're seeing a lot of attacks through people and trying to get that information through people. We'll talk about planning for tomorrow, right? How are companies preparing? How are they planning? What is some strong leadership around this, around cybersecurity and privacy, and building a playbook? And we'll talk about how prepared are businesses from the fallout, and then what are some lessons learned and actions you can take. And we'll try to give you some real relevant, client experiences, not naming any names, but to talk through that. Kevin, next.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dave. All right. So while the slide we have up on screen now may look like the answers to the world's most terrifying round of Jeopardy, these statistics show that cybersecurity is no game. Curated from a multitude of statistics, we've chosen just 8 that demonstrate how perilous the cybersecurity landscape has become. There were over 15 billion known records that were lost, stolen, or exposed in 2019. That's roughly twice the population of Earth, and reflects a 284% increase over 2018. There's a cyber attack happening every 39 seconds, which means that by the time I'm done with this slide, someone somewhere will have my social security number. A lot of smaller businesses feel that they are too small to be noticed by criminals, but these companies are the victims of almost half of all attacks. By far, the #1 attack vector, as Dave alluded to earlier, is spear phishing attacks, which account for over 90% of data breaches. We'll be looking at spear phishing in more detail a little bit later on in the presentation. The average days to detect an attack, which is known as dwell time, is 206 days. So if an attacker made their way into your business today, we wouldn't discover their presence until early next year. Once discovered, it then takes an average of 73 days to contain the breach, which means that we're now a couple of months past early next year. And finally, if you're not prepared, it's going to cost you. Breach-related costs will be almost 40% higher if you don't have the proper response plan in place. And before we get into the bulk of our content here, let's just take a moment to look at how prevalent cybersecurity threats have become. Over the last several years, data breaches have been making headlines on an all too frequent basis, with no industry or sector spared from their impact, including retail, government, healthcare, sports, politics, and even entertainment. In just the last few weeks, we've seen major breaches in the news, including Blackbaud, Garmin, and Twitter. At this rate, if we want to continue showing major breaches on this chart, well, to paraphrase the movie Jaws, we're going to need a bigger slide. And for every incident that does make the news, there are thousands more that are happening under the media's radar. The bottom line, really, there's nowhere left for us to hide. So we all have to do our part to avoid becoming that next data breach headline. So let's begin that process by asking the fundamental question, what is the definition of risk? Well, we define risk as a set of scenarios based on impacts to assets by potential threats attempting to take advantage of vulnerabilities. The level of risk grows exponentially when the value of the assets increase, the threats become more dangerous, and/or the number or magnitude of the vulnerabilities grow. In terms of the threat actors, who's causing all of these headaches? Well, this slide provides us with a look at the nefarious individuals that we're up against. To help reduce some of the anxiety generated during this discussion, we've converted these terrifying criminal threats into brightly color-coded emojis. And these threats range from hacktivists, who are hackers that take umbrage with organizations or individuals that they feel hold different beliefs, to criminals who have monetized cybercrime, all the way to terrorists and nation states who utilize cybersecurity for disrupting critical infrastructure or even taking lives. One dramatic example of weaponized cyber attacks is Stuxnet, which was malware introduced into a uranium enrichment facility in Iran, causing equipment to malfunction, ultimately leading to the destruction of hundreds of nuclear centrifuges. There's a growing belief that the next world war will not be waged on battlefields, but behind keyboards and mice. In terms of what motivates these threat actors that we just looked at, it is primarily to inflict harm or to steal information. And it's no easy task to protect a business's information, as it can be found on servers, workstations, mobile devices, flash drives, and the cloud, able to be accessed anywhere and at any time. All of this data adds up to a virtual treasure chest of information, including intellectual properties, social security numbers, financial reports, credit card data, protected health information, and other sensitive information. And the unfortunate reality is that cyber criminals know that this data is out there, and they are hard at work each and every day devising new ways to steal as much of it as they possibly can. And they have the time, the patience, and the capabilities to accomplish that goal. And if these threat actors succeed, the cost of an attack can be devastating. Earlier this week, Capital One was hit with an $80 million fine for their 2019 breach. Thankfully, they weren't forced to change their marketing from what's in your wallet to who's in your wallet. Well, after a breach, there can be these types of fines and penalties resulting from the multitude of data regulations. There are technology expenditures related to replacing or repairing hardware and software that was compromised during an attack. There's the forensic and legal costs related to cleaning up after a breach. There may be notification costs such as credit monitoring expenses for any customers who had their information stolen. There's also the loss of productivity. During the downtime needed to investigate and remediate the breach, your ability to provide services may be severely affected. And the most staggering cost is one that may not immediately come to mind, and that's the reputational damage incurred after an attack. This might have the biggest price tag of them all, because at the end of the day, customers are going to be reluctant to do business with a company that can't protect their information. And while cybersecurity was already an almost untenable challenge, in just a few moments, we'll be showing that thanks to COVID, things have gotten much, much worse. I'll turn things over back to Dave.
Yeah, so we'll spend a little bit of time and talk about crisis management and how to address some of the things that we're seeing out there. What some of the key things are is to, adapt, evaluate, and understand what some of the issues are that have happened. Evaluate your cybersecurity and privacy controls. Look at your environment. Like Kevin was talking about before in one of those slides on assets, right? It's very important to understand what some of your significant data is, what your significant applications are, and how you're going about protecting it. And to revisit that at the C-suite level to really understand, a lot of times I'll talk to clients in an audit committee, a board, or just with the C-suite and work with them. And I ask them, do you know what your sensitive data is? Do you know what your critical assets are and what you're really trying to protect? What's the likelihood and impact of a breach? And a lot of times clients can think about it, but they haven't overtly thought about it, right? Which is a critical distinction in this time of what's happening. Do you have a solid plan for crisis management? Do you have the right team? Is your technology and infrastructure built to handle this crisis? Work at home is likely to continue for a period of time for sure. Look at financial strength and have the right relationships in place with external advisors to guide you through this. Next slide.
All right, so thanks, Dave. So due to the immediacy of the COVID-19 outbreak, businesses were forced to expand their VPNs and other remote connectivity solutions on an unprecedented scale. With little time to confirm proper security protocols were in place, such as multi-factor authentication. So due to a scattered workforce no longer working in a traditional office environment, IT departments may no longer be able to monitor and contain these threats to network security like they could do in a traditional office environment. These technology risks are compounded with vulnerabilities related to the usage of unsecured and unsupported personal computers and home-grade networking equipment that may not receive the same level of patching and firmware updates that corporate equipment does. Businesses are also a prime target for phishing attacks. Spear phishing attempts have spiked over 600% since the pandemic began, with criminals using PPP and COVID attack vectors to take advantage of end users' thirst for information. Now, you factor in the inherent distractions of working from home and prioritizing keeping users operational over the provision of updated security training, and the likelihood of successful spear phishing and malware attacks have become exponentially greater. Additional concerns involve disgruntled employees not complying with security policies and the privacy risks associated with sensitive conversations being overheard by family and Amazon Echo and Google Home devices. And you can see why working from home has significantly raised the level of cybersecurity risk. And we talked about how the spike in Spear phishing attacks, here are just a few examples of some emails that have come through that are virtually indistinguishable from an actual trusted sender. I mean, these sophisticated spear phishing emails are used by attackers, almost indistinguishable. And take another look here at some of the websites. So in addition to spear phishing emails, criminals have also attempted to take advantage of the chaos by spinning up thousands of COVID-related scam websites. Some of these sites, like what we're looking at here, like the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard, have been embedded with dangerous malware by criminals, allowing them to use a human-based virus to spread a computer-based virus. Kind of ironic. So, Dave?
So here, this section will talk a little bit about, revisiting what you have, right? Looking at a holistic approach to cyber risk management. Next slide. History's proven that the key to successful recovery is preparation, right? Doing that assessment, doing the analysis, identifying key action steps on how to secure the business, right? Allocating appropriate dollars to save on a breach or an incident occurring. A lot of times we see if companies spend $10, $15, $20,000, it can save them hundreds of thousands of dollars in a breach or in a server being compromised, things like that. And reassess your strategic plan. Next slide. Right, looking at the business model, doing an assessment of talent, compensation planning, supply chain, financial considerations, looking at new guidelines, and we are seeing new guidelines come out as it relates to what information can be shared, new privacy guidelines, and new security regulations by industry and by state, right? Next page. And then here we'll talk a little bit about some of the cybersecurity and privacy disruptors. Kevin?
All right, thanks, Dave. Okay, so now that we've looked at the cybersecurity landscape, let's look at some of the hottest topics that businesses need to be aware of so that they can remain safe. And while there are many facets of a robust cybersecurity strategy, we'll focus on 7 that we feel will provide the best help in creating a pathway towards a more secure future. So through our discussions with members of the C-suite, our team consistently encountered executives who possess only a cursory understanding of where their critical systems and data are, as Dave mentioned earlier, and have only invested limited time considering the likelihood and impact of a data breach, oftentimes hoping that IT has it under control. But unfortunately, hope is not a strategy. So without a thorough understanding of risks or having processes in place to govern them, a business's ability to avoid attack is significantly more difficult, because you really, at the end of the day, you can't protect what you don't know you have. So in terms of assessing risk and determining how mature controls need to be, being proactive versus being reactive makes defending your business considerably easier and far less expensive when responding to a risk. A good starting point for risk assessment involves identifying and documenting critical systems and sensitive data and the protections that are in place. And since most companies rely on outside technology resources, this same identification and documentation process should be completed for any and all third-party providers. From there, threats and threat actors should be identified and prioritized, including where they can originate from, the likelihood of an incident, and the associated impact and cost. A determination should then be made related to how mature the business's controls are versus how mature they need to be to address each risk. To add structure to the governance process, a written information security program, or WISP, should be developed. And to avoid recreating the wheel, consider using an established industry framework, such as those developed by NIST, their 800.30 publication, when developing these security programs or risk assessments, instead of developing one from the ground up. Finally, to ensure that governance is maintained and that risk assessment results are addressed, a formal cybersecurity committee should be established. So let's move on to vulnerability management. So today's technological safeguards do an extraordinary job at protecting us, and most criminals don't want to battle firewalls and intrusion detection systems to get to a business's data. Instead, the most efficient path to steal an organization's data or deliver ransomware is through the use of social engineering attacks. These attacks most commonly appear as spear phishing emails, but can also be perpetrated by other means such as smishing, which involves attacks delivered by text messages, and vishing, which are attacks delivered by voice, such as criminals calling and pretending to be a member of your IT department who desperately need your login credentials. So spear phishing has become so prevalent that Gmail is blocking more than 100 million phishing emails per day. That's just Gmail. It has also become very effective as 94% of malware and 91% of data breaches originate from these spear phishing attacks. A subset of phishing called whaling, which are phishing attacks focused on members of the C-suite and senior management. And while we talked about the effectiveness of the technological safeguards, they are not without their vulnerabilities as well. Every unpatched or misconfigured server, network device, application, computer, or mobile device is a potential conduit for criminals to achieve their insidious goals. Penetration testing, which is when technology is probed by a trusted resource to identify vulnerabilities, is conducted by only 20% of companies. And if you need to know what can happen when a server is unpatched, the Equifax breach is a perfect example, as this vulnerability led to a massive breach that exposed personal information for almost 150 million users. One server that was unpatched. So for social engineering, it's imperative that a trust but verify approach is utilized to gauge your employees' ability to detect and avoid attacks. This can be accomplished by conducting simulated social engineering campaigns that include spear phishing campaigns, USB drive drops to test whether users would plug in unknown devices, and even consider giving smishing and vishing simulations as well. And for penetration and vulnerability testing, carefully select a certified professional that can act as a simulated bad guy, if you will, to identify and address those vulnerabilities before the actual attackers show up. These tests should be conducted on a periodic basis with any identified vulnerabilities prioritized and then addressed. Since the average cost of a data breach is almost 40% higher when there is no incident response plan in place, it's critically important that one is developed and periodically tested. A recent study showed that 77% of organizations don't have formal cybersecurity incident response plans in place, as well as not applying them consistently across their organization. Without having that plan, an effective response is almost impossible to execute when an actual data breach were to occur. This can result in extended downtime, loss of public trust, as we talked about, the reputational damage, and significant compliance fines and penalties. To greatly increase the chances of surviving and quickly recovering from an incident, a formalized cyber incident response plan should be developed. Key components of this plan include detailed action steps, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and effective methods of communication. And while having a plan is critically important, you're only halfway there where you need to be. The plan needs to be routinely tested, and backups, often the sole way to recover from an incident, need to be regularly tested to ensure their viability. And if a business doesn't have the internal forensic resources, a third-party incident response and forensic resource should be proactively enlisted so that they are readily available. You don't want to wait until after an event occurs to then try to find a solution. In developing relationships with local law enforcement or similar agencies such as the FBI's InfraGard program is another way to share best practices related to incident response. In today's world, third-party services are critical to businesses' success. These services take many forms, including technical support providers, cloud-based financial applications, security monitoring, email, and off-site data backup solutions. It's really important to remember that these providers are not immune to disruption, including those related to COVID-19, and they range from deleted manpower to outright insolvency. The pandemic has acted as a universal disaster recovery plan for almost every business in the world, uncovering many unanticipated issues and limitations related to third-party resources. For example, a service provider may have an overseas workforce located in an area that has yet to be severely impacted by COVID. So while the services remain stable for now, is that stability guaranteed in the months ahead? To minimize the risk associated with these third parties, here are some considerations. Begin by developing policies and procedures related to third-party service providers. Key components of this governance may include each provider's purpose, definitions, scope of coverage, roles and responsibilities, monitoring, exit strategies, governance, and oversight. Consider having a protocol that requires obtaining and evaluating SOC reports and SLAs for each provider. From there, compile an inventory of all third-party providers used by the business. To make sure that the list is comprehensive, utilize business stakeholder surveys, accounts payable vendor listings, and legal and/or procurement contract databases. The use of inherent risk assessments is also valuable, which can be accomplished by using a grading system that is completed by the business. Sample assessment is shown here. And vendor due diligence questionnaires that are completed by the vendor should also be utilized to identify any potential risks. From there, residual risk should be determined and evaluated, and ongoing monitoring should be performed to identify any new risks that may arise. Here's some additional examples of these types of questionnaires. So regardless of the type of information a business collects, chances are that there are regulations that will be need to met. For example, if a business collects personally identifiable information or PII, such as social security numbers, there are state regulations that will need to be met. Since there is no federal standard in place, all 50 states have implemented data breach notification regulations of their own. Another couple of dozen states took it a step further and rolled out data security and privacy regulations. If the PII is related to a member of the European Union, well, the requirements of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, will need to be met. California, well, they just rolled out their new California CPA, Consumer Protection Act. So you can see that these regulations are constantly evolving. And if protected health information, or PHI, is being kept, the requirements related to HIPAA come into play. Credit card data, well, welcome to the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. And coming soon, if you do business with the Department of Defense and you maintain controlled unclassified information, or CUI, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, will need to be obtained. And while it's no doubt painful, especially for smaller businesses, to achieve and maintain compliance, there are incentives for doing so, including enhanced security, avoiding fines and penalties, and building confidence with customers and business partners. So where does a business begin in their quest for compliance? Well, begin by assigning an individual or team within your organization to handle this type of compliance, making them responsible for enforcing privacy. Don't pass this responsibility to unqualified individuals. Chances are the receptionist is probably not adept at meeting the requirements of the HIPAA security rule. Also, don't store sensitive data unless it has a critical business purpose, and even then, enforce a strict retention policy. And as you work through your compliance efforts, document and maintain evidence of your efforts in the event they are needed after a breach. A logical sequence to reach compliance typically involves a gap assessment, followed by remediation, and then compliance testing, and then the issuance of any applicable reporting. Remember that compliance is not a one and done. It is ongoing and requires sustainment efforts and resources in order for you to remain compliant. And as discussed earlier in the presentation, when we covered social engineering, employees are often the weakest link in the security chain and need to be aware of the risks that could impact their organization. These risks include being aware of spear phishing and other social engineering attacks, the importance of handling and securing hard copies of sensitive data, regulatory compliance requirements, remote and mobile computing best practices, as well as the dangers related to USB drives. To provide the necessary awareness, every business should develop a training program, delivery format, and duration that meets their specific needs in order to maximize their employees' ability to retain key security concepts. For example, for a business that has employees scattered in many locations or working from home, as many of us do, a video conference or on-demand training video would be optimal. This training should be provided during the onboarding process before a user even puts their fingers on a keyboard, and then repeated at least annually. Additional focus training should be provided for anyone with direct contact with PHI, PII, or other sensitive information. An additional focus should be placed on detecting and avoiding social engineering attacks, which, as discussed, is certainly the most prevalent method used by cyber criminals. Dave?
Great. Thank you, Kevin. So in terms of, next steps, what do we need to do? What do we think the future can look like in this particular environment? Next slide. Right. A lot of the times we like to see and suggest that our clients and companies, they're doing an overall risk or cyber maturity assessment within the organization. Try to anticipate and stay current on new relevant regulatory compliance requirements. Have a cybersecurity awareness training program. I can't reinforce enough how important it is to educate the people in the business, train the people in the business on what some of these issues are. What does a phishing attempt look like, right? How do people get you to click a link or enter some sensitive data, and where you end up with a ransomware issue, right? Have you looked at, and do you have written information security policies and procedures? Have you had a penetration or vulnerability test performed? And do you have a comprehensive incident response plan? And have you tested it? Have you done what's called the tabletop exercise, where you're working with other key members within the organization and you're coming up with different scenarios and things like that? Next slide. All right. And then you ask yourself, your management, your team, your employees, what lessons have been learned, right? What improvements can you get? What was the vision prior, and what is our vision going forward? Are you using more technology around work at home? Have you looked at that technology and seen if that is set up in a secure way? Do you have dual factor authentication in place, right? What is the change in your business? Do you have new products? Do you have new services in place where you may need to have some security or privacy considerations? And then does your brand, reflect who you are and who you still want to be in this new world? Next. Okay. And, a lot of times there's a saying, right? Of course, it's hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it, right? COVID's brought, enough damage, and don't let the damage define the company's legacy, right? Instead, leverage the strengths of your business and focus on the future and what do you think the new normal will be, and have you done a controls-based assessment around that to make sure you're going to be operating in a controlled way. Next slide. And then I guess we'll turn this over with Barbara, if you'll join back, and if there are any questions that we have from the audience.
Thank you very much. I think everyone is just overwhelmed by all the threats that are out there. It's almost like they're coming at you from all directions, and being able to stop everything feels a bit impossible in some ways. But you've really given us some good guidance about how we can take steps to protect ourselves. Because NRBP represents a lot of smaller businesses, I want to focus a little bit on some of the points about what small businesses can do. You had a statistic, I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like 43% were attacks against small businesses. And I can see why that is, because it's a little bit harder to establish a policy when you have, 10 or under employees and you don't have the protocols in place. Similarly, during COVID, I think more small businesses, it's just a guess, are bringing their own laptops into the picture, and whatever protections are on those laptops are less than what the company might provide in the office. So couple of questions from this. One is, if the company is mostly operating in the cloud versus having the server that is on site, is there any greater protection or ability to preserve their information?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, it's interesting. Over the last years, cloud-based security and the philosophy has evolved, right? You know, a lot of times people used to say 3, 4, 5 years ago, it's riskier in the cloud. You don't know how other companies, those vendors are protecting your data. However, if you're a small company and you don't have a big security team, there's now a perspective that it's actually safer in the cloud if it's a well-established company like Amazon Web Services, right? Or Azure and things like that. And there are cybersecurity reviews that can be done and are done over the cloud, and looking at different checklists and questionnaires, and also user control considerations. So considerations as to what is the user of that applications and data in the cloud doing? Do you have good, role-based security set up? Do you have segregation of duties and things like that? Kevin, do you have anything to add?
I do, Dave. Thanks. So yeah, a lot of people feel as though, when they're in the cloud, it's almost a set it and forget it type mentality, Barbara, where, okay, I'm in the cloud now, everything's fine. In today's point, it is certainly safer than what most smaller organizations can do. I mean, these cloud organizations have 24/7, security teams that are protecting your data. They're doing typically a much better job, but they are not invulnerable. And I think everyone needs to remember that even though they're in the cloud, you still have to prepare for potential rain. And what I mean by that is, recently there was a company called HealthWise, also known as Kasamba, and they basically were a cloud application, and we had a few of our clients that were utilizing them, and that company, that cloud-based company, was hit with ransomware, and they were taken completely offline for weeks. And our clients couldn't bill, the inability to send invoices out, couldn't track their employees, ability to provide services. They were brought to a standstill. So again, the cloud absolutely more secure than most small businesses would be able to, put in place, but they are not infallible. So you have to have plans in order in the event that they were taken offline. And if I could just give one additional tip there, is that, a lot of people feel as though that, when an employee leaves, HR can take their time and communicate that to IT or whoever the administrator is of that cloud application. And I would highly recommend that communication be immediate, if not proactive, because a lot of employees could leave the company and their cloud connectivity hasn't been disabled for a day, for a week, whatever it may be, and could slip through the cracks. And if that individual is disgruntled or has an axe to grind, well, then they can do some significant damage from their car, when they're sitting, in the parking lot. So again, you want to just really make sure that HR and IT are communicating closely in order to really close down that potential vulnerability for cloud applications.
Good.
I'm surmising from the things you've said that it's probably a good idea, if employees are using their personal device, that perhaps there be some guidelines issued. You should the personal device have things like Windows Defender or Malwarebytes, the sorts of protections, and advising the employee to do regular patches and updates from either Windows or from the whatever is the technology of their device. I know I have a Dell, and I pay attention to the Dell updates all the time to be able to install whatever the latest patch is. So
yeah, that's No, Barbara. Yeah, no, that's critically important, and that's very, very important that these home users, again, that were dispersed very quickly. There was very little preparation time, and people forced to use their home computers. They may be still running unsupported operating systems. For example, Windows 7, which no longer received updates as of January 14th of this year. That hasn't been patched in 6 months. So if people are using a little bit older, home technology, or a home router, for example, most likely a lot of us may not have the wherewithal to be able to go in and update the firmware on our home routers, which could potentially expose that data. So certainly there should be a checklist developed by your IT consultant or your in-house IT of certain standards and configuration standards that need to be met for home equipment. And I think it's a worthwhile investment to ensure that those configuration standards have been met.
You just raised something I hadn't even thought about, but our router hasn't been updated in about 4 or 5 years. And I'm thinking I should contact Verizon. Yeah.
Barbara, I'm actually logged into your router as we speak right now, and I'm just kind of going through some files. So no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding, of course. But no, you really, that's a great point. Yeah, if you go to your manufacturer's website, they'll be able to, most likely provide instructions on how to download that latest patch and how to install it. Thankfully, it's fairly painless. Probably only takes you less than 5 minutes to run through the process. But again, a lot of people may not be aware that they need to do that. And these older routers that haven't been patched have a lot of vulnerabilities. And if you're driving by, because they're wireless in most cases, you could potentially be breached without even knowing it. So.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. All right. You mentioned smishing and vishing. What are those?
Okay. Smishing is based on SMS or short message. Basically, that's a text message. And let me give you an example of what that could be, is that you may receive an unexpected text that looks as though it's from a trusted source, say, for example, your bank. And within that text, there'll be a link saying, click here. We've seen some activity come through, your banking accounts, and you need to click here to log in. And what it'll do is that link, just like a spear phishing that would come in via email, it'll take you to a facsimile of a trusted site. You go ahead and put your credentials in, and now they've harvested those credentials, and they can then use that to log into the actual banking website. So again, consider unexpected communications from any channel, whether it be an email, a text, or a phone call, to be potentially suspicious, and you really just want to be cautious before either clicking anything or replying with any sensitive information.
I found personally that I get either a text or an email from somebody I know, but if I look at the address, I can see that it's not that person's address. So you might have, XPQRZ in the name of the address, and I know that it's not that individual, and then it's somebody trying to get in.
Absolutely.
So I think it pays to be looking at the address that it's coming from, even if it looks like it's coming from somebody that you know.
Yeah, we're so conditioned by the immediacy of today's world, where it's like you just want to get back to people, you want to click on a link that they provide whatever they're asking for. Sometimes we just, unfortunately, we're a little bit extra trusting, and we may click on something that we shouldn't. So, my recommendation is always just take a moment, and if you weren't expecting that message from that person at that time, pause, either pick up the phone and call them, or send a separate communication to them verifying it is who, in fact, they are pretending to be.
Yeah. Nobody has ever bothered if you write back to them and say, hey, did you intend to send me this attachment? And if so, please verify that you were sending me that attachment. And just
Barbara, and if I could just do one add-on, that's a great strategy. I would just make sure that you select the person's name from your contact list versus replying. So in other words, you create a brand new channel of communication. So.
No, I do that. I open a new email and send it to the person at the address that I have for them. The other thing that I think is a useful technique that I've used is if I'm unsure about an email, I use the view feature in Outlook rather than actually opening it. So I can see the address that it's from and the content before
that little
opening.
preview. Absolutely.
I just, if I were, and I'm actually just having this conversation based on things that I'm thinking of. No questions have come in from the audience. I think we've stunned them with how much that there is to think about. But I think that just always taking a moment, not reacting immediately, taking a moment to look at whatever it is before you click, before you open, is very sensible. And I think also that for our small business people, that some of the stuff you're recommending is going to feel beyond what they can do. And what I take away from this is, even if you can't get to everything, if you can get to some of the things, then you are that much safer because you've done those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's an expression, when you're being chased by a bear, you don't need to be faster than the bear, you just need to be faster than the person next to you. And the more you can do and knock out that low-hanging fruit, the better protected you're going to be, and they may move on to a weaker, victim. So, and if we just have one more moment, Barbara, just one story that Dave and I share is, we talked about small businesses, being hacked and becoming victims. And, a lot of people feel, as though Target, everyone remembers that was kind of the big attack that kind of started the, getting national attention there. That began, just a little bit of background. Basically, there was a small HVAC company in New Jersey, Fazio HVAC, and they were the ones that were initially hit. And because they provided services to Target, they had access to Target's billing system. So basically, they used spear phishing to infiltrate this tiny little HVAC company, and then they use that to kind of piggyback into Target's system. So my point here is that you may think, if you're a small business, I don't have a lot of critical data, I don't have a tremendous amount of information that bad guys would be willing to steal or looking to steal, but they may not be looking for your information. They just may be looking to, again, use you as a conduit to get to a bigger prize. So that's why small businesses really have to be very, very careful.
Right. Any other points that you'd like to underscore? And I'll give everybody one last chance to pose any questions.
Barbara, maybe as we wait for those questions, I know we have a couple of more slides. If Dave would want to just take a look at some of the services we offer here while we're waiting. So.
Yep. Next
page. Actually, I do have one other question about the USB that you mentioned.
Yeah.
What in particular do people need to be guarded against with a USB?
Okay, sure. It's kind of a twofold threat there, Barbara. USB drives now are become so expensive, and the capacity is so high that if you have a disgruntled employee, say for example, someone's moving on to another company, well, before they leave, they may want to pull all of your client data. They may want to pull out, a very sensitive, IP that you have stored on your server, so they can plug that USB drive in, copy over the contents typically of an entire network drive, and walk out the door, with really no one being the wiser. So there's a threat there. So companies should consider locking down the ability for even plugging in USB devices. So that's kind of threat number one. But threat number two is that you can very easily put malware on a USB drive. And then this is what we do for our testing, is that we'll leave our USB drives in the parking lot. We'll leave them in a conference room, in a restroom. And then we have the ability, when they plug it in, it's not malware, but it does send a signal back to us, and it tells us the computer name that plugged it in. And 9 out of 10 times, curiosity gets the better of someone, and they wind up plugging it in. Now, again, it's benign because it's us just using this as a test. But if there were malware on that USB drive, well, now you've introduced that into your environment. So employees should basically know, all right, look, unless you have a legitimate business use for a USB drive, they should not be in your environment. You should never plug one in without checking with IT, and you should just be really cautious. So that's the threat. I feel as though, again, there's two concerns there with USB drives.
What about a USB that's given out at a conference that's branded with a company name? Are those safe?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, it's funny because, Dave and I, we attend various security conferences through the years, and it's kind of ironic that a lot of security companies hand out USB drives to the visitors to their expo. And I personally, I'm a little, paranoid. I would not plug those in. I would not consider them safe, but, typically they would be, but you may not want to take that chance.
Right. So we do have a couple of minutes if you want to present one slide.
Okay. Yeah, so on this slide, this is just some of the areas that we've been helping companies with. On the top left around cybersecurity, privacy, business risk and maturity assessment. In the middle, threat and vulnerability management, pen testing, incident response, compliance and frameworks, data mapping, and then various programs where we could be a virtual chief information security officer on a part-time basis, full-time basis, part-time basis, different policies, procedures, third-party risk management, and helping manage the vendors, disaster recovery, and IT due diligence. So just a little bit more. Kevin, our contacts are either on the next slide or the slide before this at the right here. Yep. If anyone wants to reach out, feel free to reach out.
We did have a last minute question come in. And the question is, what's the security risk with Alexa, Google Home, or other smart electronics?
Yep. And Kevin, you can, if you want to cover that.
Yeah, there's a couple of concerns there, Barbara. They just did a study, and again, this is kind of terrifying, but they did a study where they were able to activate and send commands to an Alexa, your home system there, using UV light. They were able to send it just by a beam of light. Basically, a laser at a certain frequency was able to trigger commands on your Alexa. So if your Alexa is tied into your home, for example, some people can start their cars using their Alexa. They can open and close locks on doors. They can turn lights on and off. So people could be outside the home or business and be able to trigger that type of activity through, again, without even being in your home. So there's a concern certainly from that perspective, but perhaps the bigger perspective is if you're having sensitive conversations and you have, again, people working from home, have an Alexa or a Google speaker in your office at home, well, that is continuously recording information. Again, whether or not Alexa would ever be able to be hacked and that information taken from Amazon or Google, depending on what device you have, risk is relatively low, but there is certainly a risk there. So what I always recommend is taking that out of your office environment, especially if you're on a lot of video calls and a lot of sensitive phone calls. You probably want to remove that out of the environment just to be safe. Again, paranoia certainly, but better safe than sorry, I would say.
Okay. All right. We have reached 3 o'clock. I want to thank both of you for a really excellent presentation, and to Citrin Cooperman for being a sponsor of this event. Reminder to everyone to please watch your thank you email. That will contain a copy of this presentation and a survey which we hope that you will take. We do want to hear from you about potential programs that we can offer, so please send me ideas. Thanks as always to the entire NRBP team, Maya Curry in particular, who was behind the scenes in setting this up and who leads our DEI program, but to everyone, and a greeting from our President and CEO, Chip Halleck, who has taken a well-deserved break this week and would normally be with us to close the program. So with that, I wish everyone well. I wish you good health and safety, and a good end to summer. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us.